Levack and Goz here with you on 104.5 The Team and 104.5theteam.com. And for my money closer, we're talking about the best bracketologist, if that's even a major somewhere in the country. Right. Look at the stats. This guy beats Lenardi. He beats Jerry Palm. He is Patrick Stevens. Make sure to follow him on Twitter at D1's Course. Patrick,
Discourse.
D1SCOURSE. There you go. Patrick, let's start with the number one seeds in the tournament. If the season were to end today, who would be the top seeds?
Kansas, Villanova, North Carolina, Gonzaga. And I think it's starting to we're not quite at the point where anybody can be completely cemented into that top line, but it is awfully hard to imagine Kansas in particular getting dislodged from it. And I think if all of those teams can have strong weeks to close out the regular season. I guess Gonzaga's already done the regular season, but the other three, if they all finish strong, I think it's going to be hard to knock any of them off that top line. But at this point, after Villanova stumbled against Butler last week, I think Kansas is the number one overall seed.
Is Gonzaga the most vulnerable to fall off the one line because of that conference tournament and a potential upset there to a lesser opponent?
Yeah, I think so. I think they had some wiggle room, and maybe a little bit more than I probably gave them credit for going into this past weekend when they lost to Brigham Young at home. Certainly not the way Gonzaga wanted things to end in their home finale this season. But you still look at them, and their profile is really good. They beat Florida on the neutral court, Arizona on the neutral court, Iowa State on the neutral court. They swept St. Mary's in the regular season. And so they had a little bit of margin for error there. At the same time, if there's a team that's lurking down on the 2 or 3 line, especially a potential second ACC team that could get hot and maybe win that conference tournament, I think that would make Gonzaga a little more vulnerable, especially if they happen to trip up in Vegas here over the next week, even if they do that against St. Mary's, who's obviously a very, very good team. I think that might knock them down to the 2 line. But for now, I think Gonzaga has enough of a profile that they would remain on the top line in the number 1 seed out in the West.
We're joined by one of the best bracketologists, bracket projectors in the country, Patrick Stevens, here on 104.5 The Team and 104.5theteam.com.
Now, Patrick, I'm a big Duke Blue Devil guy, so it's been kind of an up-and-down season for me, especially this past week with 2 losses, especially losing to Goz's Orange, which has been atrocious for me to handle. But this team is very inconsistent. What do you see from this team that could possibly have them go somewhat deep in the NCAA tournament?
Well, there's no doubt that they have talent, and there's no doubt that they have the best coach in Division I history, although if you want to argue John Wooden, I'm certainly open to that. And so they have a lot of pieces there, and the pieces just haven't entirely fit together for more than 2 or 3 games at a clip, it feels like, this season. But it's still a team that won at Virginia, won at Notre Dame, beat Florida on a neutral court. They beat North Carolina at home. So there's a lot of results that suggest these guys can be pretty good. The question is, can they string it together for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 games against high-end competition? You go back to the idea that between Krzyzewski's absence and injuries and Grayson Allen's suspension, that this is a team that really didn't have the opportunity to develop cohesion very early in the season. Really didn't even have a chance to do it during preseason practice. And I do wonder whether that ultimately catches up to them in March and kind of creates more of a ceiling than you would think that they would normally have. And I expect to see Duke in the second weekend of the tournament. I'd be surprised if they didn't get that far. But beyond that, I'm not sure they can be consistent enough to win a national title. Do they have the ability to do it? Yes, I think so. But the consistency, that's a much bigger question and a much dicier situation, and I'm not sure that they can string together the 3 or 4 consecutive high-end performances necessary to win a national title once they get to that second weekend.
We'll swing it back locally here in the Capital Region. We have the America East Tournament starting on Wednesday here at the SAFQ Arena with the Great Danes of Albany. We have the Siena Saints. We know you've covered Coach Jimmy Patsos before in the time there in the Beltway. When you look at the MAC, you look at the America East conferences overall, where could you see maybe an Albany or a Siena or representative from those conferences in the NCAA tournament?
Well, I think that the upside for a team other than Vermont out of the America East probably isn't all that high. I mean, I think that you're probably at that point hoping that you end up on the 15 line if everything breaks right. And I don't know if even that is going to happen. You look at just kind of the overall profiles, double-digit losses, all that. And so I think a 15 or a 16 for anybody other than Vermont would be the fate for somebody out of the America East. And then out in the Metro Atlantic, it's kind of the same way to a lesser extent. I think that you're probably looking at a champion if it's Iona or St. Pete's, or really those two. I would say they could get themselves onto a 14 line if things broke right. Probably more like a 15 line. Monmouth, obviously, a team that they could be an absolute menace for somebody. Sort of a team that we all forgot about a little bit after their great victories last season, but they've probably been more consistent and maybe a little bit better this year. I think they could be a team that winds up as high as a 12 seed if things break right for them. And then a team like Siena, let's say they ran the table and got themselves to 18 and 16, I guess it would be. That's still going to be a tough sell just with all those losses to get themselves much higher than a 15 seed on Selection Sunday. Although they would obviously pick up a few decent victories along the way in Albany if they happen to win this event this weekend.
So, Patrick, you were talking about Monmouth could be as high as 12. Would it be possible now, we haven't seen this for years, that if Monmouth were to lose the MAC tournament, they would get an at-large bid?
I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, when you look at what have they done, when you size up what are their victories, what can you stack them up with other people, that they have one top 100 victory. They beat Princeton right before Christmas. And the committee's really veered toward, really weighing the value of quantity of high-end victories, which is why you would see a team that frankly belonged in the tournament like St. Bonaventure last year and played like 5 top 100 games or top 50 games and didn't get in, as opposed to a team like Michigan that had like 14 opportunities and ultimately picked up like one more than Bonaventure did, that they got into the tournament. So I don't really like Monmouth's chances at all. I give them a ton of credit for having avoided silly losses for most of this season. I'm sure they wish they could have that one weekend back right around New Year's when they lost to Ryder in St. Pete's. But besides that, they haven't done anything remotely questionable. And quite frankly, losing at St. Peter's is hardly a major crime, given that that's the second-best team in the league. So I like Monmouth a lot, and I got to admit I'm kind of rooting to see if what would happen if they got into the tournament. They'd be a pretty nasty team to have to play if you were a 4 or 5 seed. I think that would be very entertaining, but I don't see them having much of a shot at an at-large.
I'm sure a lot of my fellow Syracuse Orange fans feel like I buried the lead in this interview, so I'll ask it now. The Syracuse Orange basketball team, are they in, are they out, do they still have work to do?
They absolutely still have work to do. I have them as the first team outside the field right now. And the big issue for Syracuse is they have not beaten anybody of substance outside the Carrier Dome. And unfortunately for them, they don't get to play any NCAA tournament games in the Carrier Dome. You look at those victories, and there's a nice string of very nice victories. Florida State, Duke, Virginia, Miami, Monmouth, Wake Forest. You're not going to argue about the fact that these guys can play somebody really tough in their own building. But you look at what they've done outside the Carrier Dome, they're 2-10 with an overtime victory over NC State and a buzzer beater at a 500 Clemson team. Yesterday, you're not going to knock Syracuse for not winning at Louisville, but it was the last road opportunity that they had to do something of some note. And so now, if you're Syracuse, I think you really need to do something in the ACC tournament. And maybe that just means winning an 8-9 game. And I'm going to assume that given how good a home team they are, they will handle Georgia Tech this weekend. Maybe not the best assumption, but let's assume that they do. I think if they get themselves into an 8-9 type game and can win that, that might be enough to distinguish themselves. Right now, it's that lack of road success that really kind of differentiates them from some of the other teams at the edge of the field. And I'm thinking about teams like Providence, Marquette, Kansas State. And it's not as if those teams are great. Providence has won at Creighton this year, and that's a pretty significant victory. Marquette has that same victory, won at Creighton, I should say. And then you look at Kansas State. Kansas State's a team that doesn't have nearly the number of high-end victories that Syracuse does, but they're 7-7 away from home, and they won at Baylor and Oklahoma State. And I think that those are the kinds of things that could really drag them into the field ahead of a Syracuse. So I think you almost have to circle that Wednesday at the ACC tournament for whoever they happen to play as really a game that's going to make a major, major difference for Syracuse. Because unlike last year, remember they had won those games down in the Bahamas, I think, against Texas A&M and UConn. They've won at Duke. They don't have that this year to really distinguish themselves in a positive way.
So, Patrick, barring any real upsets in these conference tournaments, is there any team that you've been following that could be a Cinderella when we look at Selection Sunday?
Oh, there's a bunch of teams that I like out there. I think a team out of the Sun Belt, Texas Arlington, is a team I really like a lot. I mean, they brought back 5 starters from a bunch that won a couple nice games last year. They won at St. Mary's earlier this season, and I think that they're plenty capable of getting a victory or two once they get into the field, if they get into the field, I should say. I think you have to kind of look at a team, I like a Middle Tennessee. I mean, I don't know, how much of a Cinderella they count as after having knocked off Michigan State last year. But at 25-4, they're 3 games up in Conference USA. There's another team, a lot like Monmouth, who belongs on this list as well, that really has the ability to do some interesting things. And I would say whoever comes out of the Horizon League, whether it's Oakland or Valpo, I think both of those teams have upset possibilities in them. And then UNC Wilmington out of the Colonial, which gave Duke a pretty good run last year, is really deep, very athletic, forces a lot of turnovers. I think they would be a real handful for a 4 or 5 seed as well.
We are less than 2 weeks away from Selection Sunday. You can feel the anticipation building. Make sure to follow him on Twitter, one of the best bracketologists. You look at the stats, this guy does it just as good as anybody. At D1's Course, Patrick Stevens. Patrick, appreciate the time. We'll talk again soon. Take care.
Thank you much, fellas.